Margaret Miller's hands shook as she folded her last clean dress into the small leather bag. Outside her bedroom window, the sound of tank engines grew louder with each passing minute. The Americans were coming. She was 19 years old, and she believed she had only hours left to live. For 2 years, the radio had told her what would happen when the American army arrived. The newspapers showed pictures and printed stories that made her mother cry at the kitchen table. German soldiers returning from the front whispered things that made young women like Margaret afraid to sleep at night. The message was always the same. American soldiers were not really soldiers at all. They were criminals released from prisons, wild men who had been promised one terrible reward for invading Germany. German women. Margaret lived in Schronhausen, a small town in Bavaria with cobblestone streets and houses that had stood for 300 years. It was April 1945, and the war was ending badly for Germany. Everyone knew it, even though speaking such words could get you arrested. The Reich was collapsing, but the propaganda machine still worked perfectly. Every day, loudspeakers in the town square broadcast warnings about the approaching American forces. 3 days ago, the local burgermeister had called a meeting. Margaret attended with 7 other young women from her street. They gathered in the town hall basement, a cold room that smelled of damp concrete and old paper. The burgermeister, a fat man with sweat on his forehead despite the cold, explained their duty to the fatherland. "You have been selected," he said, not looking at any of them directly. "The American forces will arrive within the week. We must protect our community. You will report to the designated facility where the occupation forces will be directed. Your sacrifice will save countless other German women from violation." Margaret felt the room spin. Around her, 2 girls started crying. One fainted and had to be carried out by her mother. But most of them just sat in silence, understanding what was being asked of them. The Reich had created 211 such facilities across southern Germany that spring. Over 2,800 young women between 17 and 30 years old had been conscripted under something called Reich Directive 7145. Margaret did not know these numbers. She only knew that her name was on a list. The propaganda had done its work well. Official leaflets distributed by the Nazi government stated clear facts, or what they claimed were facts. The American soldier has been promised the bodies of German women as reward for invasion. Another publication, printed on official Reich stationery, claimed that American units included special battalions made up of men taken from prisons and mental hospitals. These were not rumors. These were official government statements. What Margaret and the other women did not know was that the Nazi leadership was simply describing what they themselves had done. Between 1940 and 1944, the German military had established over 500 military brothels across occupied Europe. They had forced an estimated 34,000 women from conquered territories to serve German soldiers. It was the Reich's own system, projected onto their enemies. If this was how Germany treated women in occupied countries, surely the Americans would do the same to German women. This was the logic of the Nazi officials who created the Comfort Girl program in those final desperate weeks. After the meeting, Margaret walked home in a daze. Her mother wept, but said nothing. What could she say? They were living under a dictatorship that was losing a war. There were no choices left. That evening, Margaret visited Herr Fischer, the old pharmacist who had known her since she was a child. He understood why she came without her having to ask. From behind the counter, he produced a small glass capsule, no bigger than her thumbnail. "Cyanide," he whispered. "If it becomes unbearable, bite down hard and it will be quick." Margaret was not the only one who made such preparations. In the city of Regensburg, records would later show that 27 young women took their own lives in April 1945 rather than face what they believed was coming. Some jumped from bridges, others used poison. A few simply walked into the forest and never returned. The fear was real, and it killed people before the Americans ever arrived. Now, 3 days after receiving her conscription notice, Margaret packed her bag. Extra clothing, toiletries, a rosary her grandmother had given her, and hidden in the bottom, wrapped in a handkerchief, the cyanide capsule. She planned carefully. She would do what was required of her, but she would not suffer endlessly. When it became too much, she would bite down on the capsule and find peace. Through her window, she could see other families on the street. Some were hiding their daughters in attics or cellars. Others, like Margaret's family, knew that hiding was useless. The Americans would search every house. Better to comply and hope for mercy, though the radio said there would be no mercy. Margaret heard her mother calling from downstairs. It was time. She picked up her bag, feeling the weight of the hidden poison like a stone in her heart. She took one last look at her childhood bedroom, at the bed where she had slept safely for 19 years, at the window where she had watched seasons change over the Bavarian countryside. The American tanks were now visible at the end of the street, massive metal machines that dwarfed the small houses. Soldiers walked alongside them, rifles ready. Margaret's heart pounded so hard she thought it might break through her chest. She clutched her bag tighter, feeling for the small hard shape of the capsule through the leather. She could not know that everything she had been told was a lie. She could not imagine that the greatest shock awaiting her would not be American violence, but American restraint. The last propaganda of the Third Reich was about to collapse, but Margaret Mueller, walking down her stairs with poison in her bag and terror in her heart, had no way of knowing that the next few days would change not just her life, but her entire understanding of truth itself. The tanks rolled closer. Margaret stepped out into the street. Her last lie was about to die. 5 months earlier, and 4,000 miles away, Sergeant William Carter stood in front of 200 American soldiers at Fort Benning, Georgia. In his hand, he held a small booklet with plain gray cover. It was called The Pocket Guide to Germany, and every single man preparing for occupation duty would receive one. What these soldiers did not know yet was that this little book would matter more than their rifles in the coming months. "Listen up," Sergeant Carter called out, his voice carrying across the training ground. It was December 1944, and everyone knew the war in Europe was reaching its end. Germany was being crushed between Soviet forces in the east and American and British forces in the west. Soon these men would not be fighting. They would be occupying. That required different training. Carter opened the booklet and read aloud. "The German woman is not your prize. Fraternization with the enemy population is strictly prohibited under General Eisenhower's Order No. 1. He looked up at the rows of young faces. "Violation carries penalties including reduction in rank, forfeiture of pay, and imprisonment up to 1 year. Some of you think I'm joking. I'm not joking. The training these men received was unlike anything in American military history. For 12 hours, they sat through modules on civilian interaction protocols. They learned about maintaining proper distance, about respecting private property, about the difference between occupation and conquest. Military police units received even more training. 36 hours of specialized instruction on what they called gender-sensitive operations. General Dwight Eisenhower himself had issued the directive on September 22, 1944. It was called JCS 1067, a dry bureaucratic name for a document that would shape the future of Germany. Unlike previous American military occupations, this one included specific protections for female civilians from the very beginning. The non-fraternization rules were comprehensive and strictly enforced. Officers attended special courses at a military government school established at the University of Virginia. Instructors hammered one point above all others. America's moral standing in the world depended on disciplined, respectful conduct. "How we treat German civilians," one instructor said, "will determine whether they see democracy as morally superior to Nazism." The pocket guide that Sergeant Carter held was given to 1.6 million American soldiers. Inside, the instructions were crystal clear. Do not enter private homes without authorization. Do not require female civilians to perform personal services. Do not initiate non-essential conversation with German women. Each soldier had to sign a form acknowledging he understood these rules. Military police would conduct random inspections to make sure every soldier carried the guide at all times. The military command took this seriously in ways that shocked even the soldiers. Between January and March 1945, before deployment to Germany even began, 217 soldiers were demoted or imprisoned for fraternization violations during training exercises. The message was clear. Break these rules and your military career is over. General George Patton, commander of the Third Army, addressed his officers on February 7, 1945. His words were recorded and later found in military archives. "How we treat German women will determine whether they see democracy as morally superior to Nazism. Your men will maintain professional distance or face my personal attention." Coming from Patton, a general known for aggressive warfare, this emphasis on restraint and discipline carried extra weight. The Army even established a special position in each company called the Non-Fraternization Enforcement Officer. This officer's only job was to monitor soldier-civilian interactions. Military police squads conducted regular patrols, specifically watching for any inappropriate contact between American troops and German civilians. Court-martial proceedings for fraternization violations were held at triple the normal rate to demonstrate how seriously command viewed these rules. For the 40,000 African-American troops receiving occupation training, the situation carried additional complexity. These soldiers faced racism in their own country, yet they were being asked to demonstrate American democratic values to the defeated Germans. Their training included special discussions about how proper treatment of German women would challenge Nazi racial ideology and stereotypes back home simultaneously. The responsibility was enormous. When American forces crossed the Rhine River in March 1945, they carried weapons and supplies. But they also carried that gray pocket guide and strict orders that made social interaction a serious offense. Each soldier knew that talking to a German woman for more than 5 minutes without official reason could end his military career. Now, on April 15, 1945, in the small Bavarian town of Bad Tölz, these rules were being put into practice. Lieutenant James Morrison walked through the Hoffman family home, his boots echoing on the wooden floors. He carried a clipboard with a form called MG 105, the standardized housing requisition form. Behind him walked a German translator, an elderly man who had lived in America before the war. Frau Hoffman and her 2 daughters stood against the wall, terrified. They had heard the same propaganda as Margaret Muller. They expected violence, violation, horror. Instead, Lieutenant Morrison maintained exactly 3 meters of distance. He pointed at rooms, and the translator explained in German what would happen. "This room will remain private," Morrison said, indicating the daughter's bedroom. He made a note on his form. "American personnel will use separate entrance and facilities." He produced a small printed sign in German that read, "Private off limits to military personnel," and asked permission to attach it to the bedroom door. The daughters, 16 and 18 years old, stared in confusion. The lieutenant did not look at them directly. He completed his inspection quickly, professionally, and left. The entire interaction took 7 minutes. Frau Hoffman sat down heavily in a chair, trying to understand what had just happened. Or rather, what had not happened. In Heidelberg, 19-year-old Greta Schultz experienced the same confusion. When the Americans arrived at her house, she hid in the cellar. She sat there for 3 hours, waiting for screams from upstairs, waiting for her mother to call for help. Finally, her mother came down the stairs. "Greta, you can come up now," her mother said quietly. "They have gone." Upstairs, Greta found 2 American soldiers sitting at the kitchen table. They were eating their own food from tin cans, not demanding anything from the family. They nodded politely at Greta when she appeared. Through gestures and a few words of broken German, they explained they would sleep in her father's study. Then they simply left the kitchen, closing the door behind them. That night, Greta wrote in her diary, a diary that historians would discover 33 years later in an attic. "I keep waiting for something to happen, but they barely look at us. They eat their own food. They stay in Father's room. I do not understand. Everything we were told was supposed to happen is not happening." The most dramatic reversal occurred in Regensburg, where Nazi officials had established a comfort facility with 24 conscripted women. When American forces arrived, counterintelligence officers immediately sealed the building. They posted guards not to use the facility, but to protect it. The women inside, who had been prepared for days of systematic assault, instead met female American medical personnel who spoke to them through translators and then arranged transportation home. Helga Weber, one of these 24 women, later gave testimony to International Red Cross investigators. "We were gathered in the gymnasium, absolutely terrified. When American soldiers entered, we thought our nightmare was beginning. Instead, they brought women in uniform who spoke to us privately. They asked about our health. They offered us food and water. Then an American officer, through a translator, told us we were free to go home. I did not understand. Nothing made sense. This contradicted everything we had been told. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. These women had been prepared for violation and found respect. They had been told Americans were barbarians and met discipline. The gap between expectation and reality was so wide that many women simply could not process what was happening. Some waited days for the real behavior to begin, for the mask to drop, for the violence they had been promised was inevitable, but it never came. The American Army had brought different orders to Germany. Colonel Robert Murphy sat at his desk in Heidelberg, studying the crisp white pages of Directive JCS 1067. Outside his office window, the American occupation of Germany was entering its second month. May 1945 had brought warm weather and a strange new kind of peace. The fighting was over, but the real work was just beginning. Murphy's job was to make sure every American soldier in the occupation zone understood the rules, down to the smallest detail. This document defines our interaction with German civilians down to the meter of distance we maintain in conversation, Murphy explained to a group of newly arrived officers. They sat in uncomfortable chairs, fresh from America, still adjusting to the reality of occupied Germany. These are not suggestions. These are orders with serious consequences. The regulations covered everything. Housing arrangements required minimum separate facilities for German families and American personnel. Food distribution had to go through German civil authorities, never as direct handouts. Medical services needed gender-matched personnel whenever possible. Personal interactions were prohibited beyond official business. The system was designed with mechanical precision to maintain absolute separation between occupiers and occupied. The consequences for violations were graduated but severe. First offense meant reduction of 1 rank and loss of 1 month's pay. Second violation brought formal court-martial with 3 to 6 months of confinement. Third violation resulted in dishonorable discharge and up to 1 year in prison. Between April and December 1945, military records documented 1,521 disciplinary actions for fraternization violations across the American occupation zone. The enforcement was consistent and ruthless. Physical locations throughout occupied territory received specific designations. Military Government Order 627 established 3 categories. White locations were permitted for American personnel. Gray locations were accessible only for official business. Black locations were completely off limits. The black designation covered 78% of German residential areas, specifically including any location with unmarried German women. These restrictions were marked with standardized signs, and military police patrols enforced them on 3-hour rotation schedules. The curfew system added another layer of separation. American troops observed a 9 p.m. curfew in 67% of occupied towns. German civilians faced a 7 p.m. curfew. This created a 2-hour buffer period when only military police were permitted on the streets. The schedule ensured that American soldiers and German women were never in public spaces during evening hours when social interaction might naturally occur. Even basic necessities were distributed through systems designed to minimize contact. Food followed a 3-tier distribution system. American supplies were transferred to German civil authorities at municipal storehouses, then to neighborhood distribution centers, and finally to individual households. At no point did American soldiers hand food directly to German civilians. Medical assistance operated through parallel facilities with separate treatment centers for military personnel and German civilians. When specialized American medical expertise was required for civilian care, strict protocols required the presence of a German medical professional and a neutral observer. Documentation was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the system. Form MG 308, called the Civilian Interaction Record, had to be completed anytime American personnel spent more than 5 minutes in conversation with German civilians. The form documented the interaction's purpose, duration, and witnesses. Military government archives contain 217,443 such forms from 1945 alone. Every single conversation over 5 minutes was logged, creating comprehensive accountability that made violations nearly impossible to hide. In Nuremberg, a woman named Elsa Schmidt kept a journal throughout the occupation. In June 1945, she wrote an entry that captured the strange reality of life under this system. The Americans have established rules where we barely see them. Food comes through our own officials. When they must enter homes for inspection, they send teams with a female translator. Their distant correctness is strange. It is not what we were told to expect. They treat us like we might break if touched, maintaining space between us as if by invisible walls. The contrast with the Soviet occupation zone was stark and deliberate. In Eastern Germany, Soviet forces operated under completely different protocols. Contemporary estimates suggested over 240,000 German women suffered sexual violence in the Soviet zone during comparable time frames. American military command was aware of these reports. The strict non-fraternization policies were partly designed to demonstrate American moral superiority, to show that democracy produced disciplined soldiers who respected human dignity even in conquest. Margaret Muller, the young woman who had carried a cyanide capsule in April, found work as a translator in the military government office by October. She wrote a letter to her cousin in Hamburg, a letter later preserved in the Baden-Württemberg State Archives. I spent the first weeks waiting for the mask to drop. Every morning I reported to the office expecting that today would be the day they revealed their true nature. But each day of respectful treatment made the next propaganda story crumble in my mind. By autumn, I found myself questioning not just what I had been told about Americans, but everything the Reich had claimed. The military police took their enforcement role seriously. Lieutenant Frank Baldwin commanded an MP unit in Stuttgart. His daily logs, preserved in the National Archives, show the routine of occupation enforcement. June 12, 1945. Patrol observed Private J. Thompson engaged in conversation with German female civilian outside designated white zone. Conversation lasted approximately 8 minutes. Private Thompson could not produce completed form MG 308. Private Thompson reduced in rank to corporal, fined 2 months' pay. Warning issued to commanding officer regarding unit discipline. The entries continued day after day. Small violations caught and punished. The message was unmistakable. Follow the rules or face consequences. There were no exceptions, no warnings, no second chances for serious violations. The system worked because everyone knew it would be enforced. Door signs became ubiquitous. Records show that 93% of requisitioned homes received signs marking private German quarters off limits to military personnel. These signs appeared on bedroom doors throughout occupied Germany, physical reminders of the boundaries that American occupation forces were required to respect. German women reported that American soldiers would not even walk past these doors without explicit permission and official reason. By August 1945, the occupation's structured formality had created a new normal. German civilians moved through their days within strict parameters. American soldiers operated within even stricter ones. The two groups shared the same physical space but inhabited separate worlds, kept apart by regulations, documentation requirements, and the constant presence of military police. Enforcement. The Joint Chiefs of Staff issued a modification on August 15, 1945, Directive, JCS 267, Option 6, slightly relaxed. Non-fraternization policies. Conversation in public places was now permitted. The prohibition against entering German homes for non-official purposes remained in place. This calibrated adjustment acknowledged that complete separation was counterproductive for long-term occupation goals, but it maintained essential protections. What made this system remarkable was not just its existence, but its effectiveness. German women who had been prepared by Nazi propaganda to expect systematic violence instead encountered elaborate protective mechanisms. The psychological impact of this reversal was profound. When you are told to expect wolves and instead meet sheepdogs who guard your boundaries, you begin to question who the real wolves were. In Stuttgart, a group of women who worked as cleaners in American offices gathered one evening in September 1945. They spoke quietly about their experiences. One woman said what others were thinking. They barely speak to us. They look away if our eyes meet. They leave rooms when we enter to clean. At first I thought they found us disgusting. Now I understand. They are following orders to respect our privacy. Our own government never gave such orders to protect us. What does this mean? What it meant was that mechanical distance, imposed through bureaucratic systems and strict enforcement, was dismantling years of propaganda more effectively than any counter-propaganda campaign could achieve. German women were learning about democracy not through speeches or pamphlets, but through daily experience of being treated with dignity by an occupying army that had defeated them in war. The lesson was being written not in words, but in the space between people, in the respectful distance that American soldiers maintained even when they held all the power. The machine of occupation ran on rules and documentation, but it was teaching something no machine could program. It was teaching that power could be restrained, that men with weapons could choose respect over violence, that enemies could treat each other with basic human decency. These were revolutionary concepts for women who had lived under Nazi rule. The invisible walls were building bridges. Dr. Anna Merkel sat across from her patient in a quiet office in Munich. It was October 1947, 2 years after the war's end, and Dr. Merkel was conducting a study that would eventually change how people understood the psychology of propaganda and its collapse. Her patient, a 23-year-old woman named Christina, had been designated as a comfort girl in April 1945. Now, Christina worked as a secretary in the American Military Government Office, wore modern clothes, and spoke confidently about democratic reform in Germany. "Tell me about the first week," Dr. Merkel said, her pen ready above her notebook. Christina's eyes looked distant, remembering. "The first week, I did not sleep. I worked during the day as a translator, and at night I lay awake waiting for the real Americans to appear. I thought the polite ones during business hours were an act. I thought surely at night, when no one was watching, they would come. It took 2 weeks before I began to believe that their daytime behavior was their real behavior. Even then, I kept expecting the change." Dr. Merkel had interviewed 214 women like Christina by late 1947. All had been designated as comfort personnel by Nazi authorities in the final weeks of the war. All had experienced the same psychological pattern: initial terror followed by confusion when expected violations never materialized, then systematic questioning of other Nazi ideological claims. The collapse of this one specific propaganda point created what Dr. Merkel called a cascade effect. When the central lie fell, she wrote in her study, the women reported that all other beliefs came into question. If the Reich had lied about this fundamental threat, what else had been false? Racial theories, leadership principles, historical claims, all became suspect once the cornerstone of fear proved to be built on deception. The transformation showed up in numbers. Military government surveys tracked civilian attitudes through monthly questionnaires. Female approval of American occupation forces stood at 14% in May 1945. By December, it had risen to 72%. The increase was most dramatic among women who had direct professional contact with Americans. Among the 3,700 German women employed by occupation authorities by late 1945, approval ratings exceeded 85%. These women became unofficial ambassadors within their communities. They told their mothers, sisters, and friends about their daily experiences. They provided first-hand testimony that countered lingering propaganda effects. In small towns across the American zone, the quickest way to learn the truth about American occupation was to talk to a woman who worked in the military government office. Cultural programs accelerated the transformation. While formal non-fraternization policies remained in effect, they evolved to permit professional interaction and supervised cultural exchange. By November 1945, the Information Control Division had established 87 America houses across the occupation zone. These facilities offered German civilians their first unfiltered access to American literature, music, films, and democratic political thought. Attendance records showed remarkable patterns. Women constituted 64% of visitors to America houses in their first year. Young women who had been most thoroughly indoctrinated by Nazi propaganda were now the most eager to learn about American culture and democratic principles. They attended lectures on women's suffrage, read translations of the American Constitution, and watched films depicting American society. In Frankfurt, Anna Becker was 21 when she first visited an America house in January 1946. She had been a member of the League of German Girls, the Nazi youth organization for females, since age 10. Nazi ideology had been the framework of her entire adolescence. Now she sat in a room full of other German women, listening to an American woman explain how democracy protected individual rights. "I remember sitting there and feeling my entire worldview shifting," Anna later told researchers. The American speaker said that in democracy, the government exists to serve the people, not the other way around. Such a simple idea, but it was completely opposite to everything I had been taught. And I believed her because I had seen American soldiers following rules that protected us. Their government had sent them with orders to respect our dignity. This proved what she was saying was true. Survey data revealed the depth of this transformation. Among women who had regular professional contact with Americans, Support for democratic governance reached 81% by spring 1946, compared to 43% among women without such contact. The numbers were even more striking for women who had been designated as comfort personnel. Among this group, support for democratic systems reached 93%, suggesting that the contrast between expectation and reality created especially powerful cognitive reassessment. The non-fraternization policies continued to relax in careful stages. In July 1945, social conversation in public places became permitted. In October, Americans were allowed to speak with German children. By December, limited social interaction with adults was authorized in public venues. Remarkably, as restrictions eased, reported violations actually decreased. The initial rigid structure had established behavioral norms that persisted even as formal constraints diminished. Despite continued prohibitions, romantic relationships inevitably developed. Between 1945 and 1949, approximately 14,175 German women married American personnel. The first such marriage was officially recorded in August 1946, after policy changes permitted fraternization under specific circumstances. These marriages required extensive background screening and commanding officer approval, creating an average waiting period of 6 months. Private Carl Schmidt met his future wife Anna in December 1945 at a public concert in Heidelberg. Under the revised rules, he was permitted to speak with her in this supervised public setting. Their courtship proceeded under strict guidelines. They could meet only in designated public locations. No private meetings were allowed. Every interaction was technically observable by military police patrols. When Carl requested permission to marry Anna in March 1946, the approval process took 7 months and included security interviews with both families. The children born from American-German relationships, estimated at 94,000 between 1945 and 1955, became living evidence of transformed relations. These children grew up in households that bridged two cultures, embodying the reconciliation that official policy had made possible through its careful progression from complete separation to controlled interaction to eventual acceptance. Diaries and letters from this period documented women's evolving attitudes with striking clarity. Helga Brandt had hidden in her cellar for 3 days when Americans first arrived in Munich in April 1945. By October 1945, she wrote a letter to her sister that captured the transformation. Last week I attended a chamber music concert organized by the Americans. I realized halfway through that I was sitting unaccompanied in a room full of foreign soldiers, feeling completely safe. This simple moment made me understand how thoroughly we were deceived, not just about these men, but about everything. The transformation extended beyond attitudes about Americans to fundamental beliefs about gender, politics, and society. Women who had been taught that females should serve the state and remain subordinate now encountered American women in uniform making independent decisions. They saw female doctors, translators, administrators, and military personnel operating with authority. The example was powerful. In Stuttgart, Margaret Mueller worked alongside Lieutenant Sarah Morrison, a female officer in the military government. Margaret watched Sarah command male subordinates, make policy decisions, and speak with authority that German women had been told was masculine territory. One evening, Margaret asked Sarah how she had gained such confidence. In America, Sarah explained, women fought for the right to vote. We fought for the right to own property. We fought for educational opportunities. Democracy means you can fight for your rights, and sometimes you win. Margaret wrote in her journal that night, "If democracy creates women like Lieutenant Morrison, then I want democracy for Germany." By 1947, the transformation was largely complete among women who had experienced American occupation directly. They had been prepared to fear American soldiers and instead received a practical education in democratic values through daily interaction. This lived experience proved more persuasive than any formal re-education program could have been. It changed not just attitudes toward Americans, but fundamental beliefs about individual dignity, gender relations, and political rights. The women, who had carried poison capsules in April 1945, now carried voting registration cards. The women who had been designated for violation now designated themselves as citizens of a new Germany. The transformation from terror to trust, from propaganda to proof, from victims in waiting to active participants in democracy had occurred, not through force or lectures, but through the simple daily experience of being treated with respect by men who had every reason to treat them as enemies but chose dignity instead. The minds had changed because the reality had spoken louder than years of lies. Margaret Wilson pushed her daughter's stroller through the town square of Schronhausen in July 1955. The cobblestones were the same ones she had walked across 10 years earlier. Terrified and carrying poison, the church still stood where it had always stood. The fountain in the center of the square still splashed the same water. But everything else had changed, including Margaret herself. Her daughter, 3-year-old Sarah, was born in America during the 2 years Margaret had lived in Virginia with her husband, Tom Wilson, an American administrator she had married in 1950. Now they were back in Germany because Tom had been assigned to help with the Marshall Plan, the massive American aid program rebuilding Europe. Margaret worked as a community liaison, helping German officials coordinate with American assistance programs. The woman who had once been selected as a comfort girl now held a position of responsibility and respect. She was not alone in this transformation. Across West Germany, researchers were beginning to document a remarkable pattern. Women who had direct contact with American forces during the occupation years showed significantly different political attitudes and behaviors compared to women who had not. The Institute for Demoscopy in Allensbach had been tracking this evolution since 1947. Their studies found that women with American contact during 1945 to 1949 showed 37% higher rates of democratic political participation than demographically matched women without such interaction. Dr. Elisabeth Koenig at the University of Munich conducted an even more focused study. Her research, published in 1960 under the title Expectation and Reality, German Women's Political Development, examined the long-term effects of the occupation experience. She tracked down and interviewed 173 women who had been designated as comfort girls in 1945. The findings were extraordinary. Among these women, 89% had become actively involved in democratic politics by 1960. They voted at higher rates, attended more town meetings, joined more civic organizations, and ran for local offices more frequently than the general female population, where only 23% were politically active. The women who had experienced the most dramatic contrast between Nazi propaganda and American reality showed the most profound long-term transformation. Dr. Koenig interviewed one woman named Helga Zimmermann, who had been designated for the Regensburg facility. Once I discovered they had lied about this fundamental threat, Helga explained, I questioned everything else I had been taught. The racial theories, the leadership principle, the claims about women's role in society, all of it became suspect. I had to rebuild my understanding of the world from nothing. That process made me careful about accepting any ideology at face value. Now I participate in democracy because I verify things for myself, rather than trusting what authorities tell me. The transformation transferred across generations in ways that researchers had not anticipated. The daughters of women who experienced American occupation demonstrated measurably different attitudes than their peers. Research conducted in the 1970s at the University of Munich found these daughters were 42% more likely to pursue higher education, 56% more likely to support gender equality initiatives, and showed significantly higher rates of democratic participation compared to daughters whose mothers had not experienced the occupation. Maria Schneider's story illustrated this intergenerational effect. Her mother had worked as a translator for American forces from 1945 to 1948. Maria grew up hearing stories about American women in uniform, about democratic principles, about the importance of questioning authority. In 1968, when Maria was 20 years old, she became one of the first women admitted to study engineering at Technical University of Munich. My mother always told me that democracy meant I could be anything I worked hard enough to become, Maria said. She believed this because she saw it proven true by the American women she worked with during the occupation. The cultural impact appeared in literature, film, and art throughout the post-war decades. Louise Rinser's 1953 novel, Die ersten Tage, The First Days, portrayed the psychological journey of a woman designated as a comfort girl who discovered unexpected dignity during American occupation. The book became an immediate bestseller in Germany and was translated into 8 languages. Its success demonstrated that the experience resonated across German society. The 1950 film Die Brücke der Hoffnung, Bridge of Hope, depicted similar themes. Through the story of a young German woman's transformation from fear to trust during the occupation years. The film became one of post-war Germany's first major international successes, winning awards at film festivals and opening conversations about how occupation had actually worked versus how Nazi propaganda had predicted it would work. Academic research continued to document and quantify the phenomenon. Professor Maria Hearn of the University of Cologne spent 15 years on a comprehensive study published in 2001. Glaube und Erfahrung, Belief and Experience, analyzed over 12,000 personal accounts, military records, and survey datasets to measure the occupation's impact on women's political development. Her conclusion was unambiguous. The contradiction between Nazi predictions and American conduct regarding German women became a central catalyst for democratization, particularly among those who had been most thoroughly indoctrinated by the regime's final propaganda efforts. The statistics told the story in numbers. In the American occupation zone between 1945 and 1949, reported sexual assaults numbered 1,336 cases with a 95% prosecution rate. This compared to estimated sexual assaults exceeding 240,000 in the Soviet occupation zone during the same period. The prosecution rate in the American zone was higher than in the peacetime American military, demonstrating that Occupation Command took violations more seriously than normal military infractions. Meanwhile, 128,400 German women found employment with occupation authorities. The 14,175 German-American marriages created thousands of families that bridged cultures. Democratic political participation by women increased from 21% in 1945 to 67% by 1949 in the American zone. Every metric showed transformation. The modern legacy appeared in contemporary polling data. The 2018 Transatlantic Trends Survey, conducted by the German Marshall Fund, found that 76% of German respondents whose mothers had experienced American occupation supported NATO and broader American alliance, compared to 54% of the general population. The attitudes formed during occupation had persisted across 3 generations. Margaret herself exemplified this multi-generational impact. After working with the Marshall Plan through the 1950s, she returned permanently to Schronhausen in 1962. In 1968, she ran for city council and won. She served for 12 years, focusing on education and women's rights. Her daughter Sarah attended university in America, then returned to Germany to practice law, specializing in women's equality cases. Sarah's daughter, Margaret's granddaughter, was elected to the Bundestag in 2013. 3 generations from the woman who carried poison to the woman who served in parliament. The transformation was personal, but it reflected a broader pattern across West German society. In her final interview before her death in 2003 at age 77, Margaret reflected on that April day in 1945 when she walked out to meet American tanks with a cyanide capsule hidden in her bag. "Everything I had been taught prepared me for the worst moment of my life," she said. "Instead, I received the first lesson in the best education I ever had. I learned that respect is more powerful than force. I learned that democracy is not just a system of government but a way of treating human beings. I learned this not from books or speeches, but from daily experience of being treated with dignity by men who had defeated us in war but chose to see us as human beings worthy of respect." The interviewer asked Margaret what she thought was the most important lesson from that experience. She thought for a long moment before answering. "The Nazis ruled through fear and told us that everyone else would rule through fear as well. The Americans showed us that power could be restrained by principle. That lesson did not just change Germany, it changed the world. Europe's most stable democracy grew from the ruins of its most terrible dictatorship, partly because American soldiers followed orders to treat German women with ordinary respect. Seeds planted with simple dignity grew into forests of democracy." Margaret Wilson died 6 months after that interview. At her funeral, 3 generations of women stood together, her daughter the lawyer, her granddaughter the parliamentarian, and her great-granddaughter the university student studying international relations. Each generation had built on the foundation that Margaret's experience created. The story of German comfort girls and American soldiers revealed history's counterintuitive mechanisms of change. Propaganda, no matter how intense, collapsed when confronted by contradictory reality. Fear, no matter how deeply implanted, dissolved in the presence of consistent respect. Transformation, no matter how unlikely, occurred when people experienced dignity instead of degradation. The women prepared for violation received respect. The women expecting barbarians met disciplined soldiers. The women told they were spoils of war discovered they were protected by law. This reversal did not just change individual attitudes. It planted seeds that grew across generations, helping transform a defeated dictatorship into a thriving democracy. In the end, the most powerful weapon in post-war Germany was not military might or propaganda or economic aid, though all played roles. The most powerful weapon was the simple choice to treat defeated enemies with human dignity. That choice, made by American soldiers following orders they did not fully understand the importance of, changed history in ways no one could have predicted. The forests that grew from those seeds of respect still stand today, providing shade and shelter for generations that never knew the fear their grandmothers carried, or the poison they hid in their bags, or the terror they felt watching tanks approach. Those forests stand as living proof that sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating enemies but from choosing to respect their humanity even when you hold all the power. Margaret's story ended, but the lessons continued, passed, from mother to daughter to granddaughter, from generation to generation, a living legacy of the day when respect proved stronger than propaganda and dignity defeated fear.